April 10th, 2003 was one of those days that will stick with me forever. I was traveling with the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. We had come into Iraq, crossed the border from Kuwait into Iraq at the end of March, and by April 10th, we were getting to our final objective, the city of Baghdad in Iraq. And this was a long push. We had a lot of things happen on the way there, but we finally got there. And our objective within the city was the presidential palace on the north side of the Tigris River. That was a place that we were sent to. It was deemed as very strategic. We had to get there and hang on to it, and so we made our way there in the middle of the night. It took us about 12 hours of fighting. Lost vehicles, a lot of folks hurt, lost some very good Marines. A lot of bad things happened that night as we fought our way to the palace, but finally we got there. When we got into the palace grounds, we had spent the entire night fighting. We had fired a lot of ammunition. We were out of most of our supplies and trying to deal with just getting settled for the first time in a very long time and still dealing with the enemy that was out in front of the palace grounds. This was a crazy, crazy time. We were told as we went through the day that there was a counterattack being planned just on the street kind of adjacent to us. Out in front of the palace, there was a large street, then a row of buildings, and then another street and another set of buildings. In that set of buildings, there were people planning this counterattack. They were going to attack us later as the sun was beginning to set, and the folks in the area didn't want that to happen, so they let us know it was coming. Well, we were in a bad spot, as you can imagine. In fact, you could say that we were in a very dangerous position. Again, fighting through the night wore us out, and we were doing our best to hang on to the ground. But had that counterattack ever come, I'm not sure exactly what would have happened. We were preparing for the worst, and as you can imagine, there was a lot of activity taking place. But somewhere along the line, one of our forward air controllers, a Marine who was with us, a pilot who worked to control the air around, he got on the radio and he discovered that there was an A-10 Warthog flying overhead. Now, where this came from, I'm not sure. It came on station, and I'm glad that it did. He was kind of alone, but he was talking to us on the ground. We were the only thing going on at that exact moment. Again, we were in a bad spot, but our forward air controller on the ground keyed that handset. He got on the radio, and he reached out and told that pilot we needed help, and that pilot brought some help to bear. Now, if you're familiar with the A-10, you know that it is an incredible aircraft. It's an amazing thing. It has a 30-millimeter cannon right in the center of the aircraft, and it's in the center because when it fires, it sounds like a freight train going through your living room. It's incredible. And it's in the center because as it fires, it needs to keep the plane from getting thrown off course, and so it has to be right in the center. It's an amazing thing, and that thing came in, and our forward air controller talked it on to our position. We were told that counterattack was happening not right out in front of where we were. We were on the palace grounds, and there was a large street there, and then some buildings, and then behind that, there was another building, and that's where the counterattack was being mounted. That A-10 was talked on to that target one time without firing. We were close. In the military, again, if you're familiar with this, there is what's called danger close. That means that you are, as the troops, too close to the objective to fire. But we were in a bad spot. And so our forward air controller talked him on one time without firing to make sure he understood where we were and where they were. And he brought him on a second time without firing. And that third time, he let that cannon go. And if you have a memory in your mind, some sound that you've heard, some memory that sticks with you, something you'll never forget, that's what this was for me and for all the Marines that were there that day. It was an incredible memory because the result was an incredible result. We were bracing for the worst. We were in a bad situation. We were going to do the very best that we could, of course, but we really needed help. And when we needed help most, that aircraft came on station, and our forward air controller reached out and said, "We need help." That help was provided, and that counterattack never came. It's an amazing thing to look back on this many years later and to wonder how many lives were saved because one guy on the ground said, "This is a bad situation. We need some help from the outside." And he did what he could to get that help exactly where it was needed at that exact moment. Lives were saved. Isn't it amazing that in our lives, outside of the military, outside of active combat, in our lives, we somehow feel as though if we're going through a difficult time, if we're struggling with something, we need to keep that to ourselves. We need to keep it to ourselves because we're afraid that if we tell someone, they're going to think that we're weak. If we tell someone, they're going to think that perhaps we're a coward of some kind, that we just don't have the ability to deal with the problem on our own. And so we allow those problems to overwhelm us and to crush us so much of the time. I look back on that story, and these real life stories have application in so many other areas of our lives, but I look back to that story over and over in my mind when I'm going through a difficult time in my life, and I think, you know what? In the military, when you reach out for help, when you get on that radio and you call for help and someone helps, you get an award, as our forward air controller did. He got an award when we came back home. So did the pilot for providing help when it was needed most. And in the military, you're considered courageous and you're considered good at your job if you have the ability to look outside of yourself and get the help that you need. That's a good thing. And people applaud you. I believe that in our lives when we're struggling, in our lives when we are overwhelmed, we too need to understand the value in reaching out for help and allowing those who have the resources to come into our lives and help us, to allow them to do that so that we can continue moving forward. Truly, that's what it is to be resilient. Resilience is something that is often spoken of. In fact, in the military, we talk about the pillars of resiliency. There is the body. It must be strong, capable of doing the job. There's the mind. It must be trained to understand what's happening and do the job. There's the body. There's the mind. There's the social aspect. We need to be connected, as certainly we are, and we need to bring those connections to bear on our problems. There's the spiritual part. That's what makes us who we truly are. Resiliency is something that we talk about, and it's something that we can even put in 4 pillars and say, this is what you need to be resilient. But how many of us actually live a resilient life? I would submit that not many. I think that most of us, when we face trials and difficulties in our lives, what we do instead of getting on the handset and asking for help is we hunker down somewhere and just hope it's going to be okay. And if it's not okay, we find someone to blame and we point out the problems in their lives, and then we say it's their fault that we're dealing with the things that we're dealing with. Why? Because we've never really defined what it is to be resilient. It's crazy in life, and again, in the military, that's where I come from. That's kind of my paradigm. In the military, we're taught to wear a mask, to pretend all of the time like everything is okay. I remember as a young Marine officer, I was a second lieutenant. I was getting ready to go from what's called the basic officer course. That's where every Marine officer starts. It's a 6-month-long course. I was getting ready to go from there to infantry officer course, where I'd learn how to be an infantry officer. Getting ready to go across the street. It was literally across the street. In the process of that, one of our advisors, who was an infantry officer, he called us together, the 12 of us who were getting ready to go over to the infantry school, and he had a conversation with us, and there were a lot of things said. One of the things he said specifically, and I'll never forget it, he said, as an infantry officer, you need to wear a mask. Now, again, I know we use that phrase a lot, but he literally said that to us. This was a long time ago. He said, you need to wear a mask. Because behind that mask, there can be pain and there can be hurt and there can be frustration and even anger. But those that you lead should never know what's going on behind the mask. There's a place for that in leadership, of course. But when I took that, the idea of wearing a mask, regardless of what's going on in my life, when I took that from leading Marines in combat to my actual life, like the one with my wife and kids and a job outside of the military, when I tried to make that translate from one place to the other, it almost ruined me. I would imagine many of you have experienced this as well. You're doing the best you can to hold it all together, but the truth, if it were known, is that you're not doing a very good job. Now, there are places where wearing a mask can be helpful in social situations. If you've ever flown on a plane, you've seen this happen. On a plane, all of us sit in a metal tube that somehow gets off the ground and into the air, really, really high into the air. Most of us sitting there have no idea how it actually gets off the ground, and even those that pretend to know don't actually know something about lift and aerodynamics and all the stuff that no one can really explain. It's kind of a cross between science and witchcraft. We're not sure how it exactly stays on the air, but for some reason, we all sit there and pretend like we're okay with it. And then turbulence starts. And then a flight attendant who also doesn't know how the airplane stays in the air will get on the radio and she'll say something like this: you need to buckle your seatbelts. That's that strap that goes across your waist, the one that is so frayed it doesn't stay tight. Put that on because we're experiencing turbulence, but it's going to be okay. She says this as she runs down the aisle and straps herself in with her 3-point harness and just hangs on. We're all supposed to believe it's going to be okay. We look around, no one else is screaming, we're wearing a mask. Sometimes socially, it's helpful to wear a mask. It prevents panic. But in our lives and in our relationships, in all of those areas that are actually important, wearing a mask prevents us from living resilient lives. In life, there will be times of trial. There will be times of difficulty. There will be those things that come in that we cannot explain. It will happen. But how we deal with those things is really the difference between success and failure. You see, there are a lot of people who are living, they're breathing, they're operating, they're functioning, they're doing the stuff that it looks like they should be doing. But on the inside, truth be told, they're as dead as if they weren't. There's a truth, it's a statement. Living is not simply the physical act of drawing breath. Many people are physically alive, and yet spiritually and emotionally and relationally, they're dead. Life happens when we decide, despite history or present circumstances, that we are going to move forward one deliberate step after another. The key word there is decide. In spite of history or present circumstances, we decide that we are going to move forward. And here's the thing: the time to decide that we're going to move forward is not when we're standing in the middle of the mess. You see, resiliency, to be resilient, to live a resilient life, is this: it's deciding ahead of time that when the difficulty comes, you will move forward. There's a man from history. His moniker is Lord Moran. Lord Moran was the personal physician of Winston Churchill during World War II and even much into the 50s and early 60s. Lord Moran was a surgeon during World War I, and during World War I, he spent much of his time, a few years in fact, in the trenches of World War I trench warfare. He spent time as a surgeon trying to help those soldiers who were dealing with all of the things that went along with that period of time. And in the process of that, he observed that there were some soldiers who did really well living in the trenches and operating in the trenches and fighting out of the trenches. There were some who were courageous in spite of extreme odds against them. They were courageous. They did the right thing. But there were also people who weren't. The term shell shock comes from that period of time. It's what we today call post-traumatic stress disorder. Lord Moran observed all of this, and eventually he would write a book entitled The Anatomy of Courage. If you have not read The Anatomy of Courage, I highly recommend it. He says a lot of things in there, but the whole book could be summed up with this phrase. So if you don't want to buy it, I'm going to sum it up for you. He said this: having observed what happened there, having lived after that, looking back, reflecting on those who were courageous and those who weren't, he said the anatomy of courage boils down to this: a man of character in peace is a man of courage in war. Think about that for a second. A man of character in peace is a man of courage in war. What does that mean? It means the person who has invested in their lives before the trial comes, before the difficulty comes, before the bombs start falling on their position. That's the man who will exhibit courage in the midst of the fight. What a truth. That is what it takes to live a resilient life. It's working. It's investing. It's making a decision before whatever happens, that when it does, and it will, you're going to move forward regardless. There are a lot of stories that illustrate this for me. I'll tell you one that really is the one, I think, that illustrates this the most clearly for me. It's one story, and then I'll be done, but don't get too excited. It's a long story. As I mentioned earlier, I was serving with the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines during the invasion of Iraq. We were the infantry battalion that moved from Kuwait across the berm, the center axis of attack, moving toward Baghdad earlier in March of 2003. We sat on the border for a while, and then March 19th, we got the order to move, to breach the berm, and then to begin moving forward, and that's exactly what we did. A lot of stories I could tell, a lot of memories from that time, as you can imagine. It's amazing how something that was a relatively short period of time can kind of frame the rest of your life. Particularly as I talk about resiliency and as I understand resiliency, those moments speak so clearly to me. There was one event during that march north, though, that illustrates this more clearly than anything else in my life. We had been moving for a few weeks, and a lot of things happened, and some of it good and some of it not so good. We were exhausted and just trying to figure things out, but we continued to move. 1,200 Marines, mechanized. We even had a tank company with us. There was a lot of stuff moving toward Baghdad. Eventually, we'd get there. But on April 1st, April Fool's Day of 2003, early in the morning, we were called to our commanding officer's vehicle. We were called there for an intelligence briefing and an update on what we would do that day. That was not uncommon. It was early in the morning. We were getting the information, and then we were told that the division commander, a man that many of you may have heard of, General James Mattis, General Mattis decided that the division had a very important objective in our area of operation. There was a very small bridge over a very small canal, aptly named the Saddam Canal, and he wanted us, the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, about 1,200 Marines, to secure this bridge that we were told was unguarded. That was our intelligence report. Never trust intelligence professionals. I'm sure there's some good ones, probably a lot of good ones. Sometimes they get it wrong. We were told that this bridge, this very small bridge over this very small canal, was very important, but that it was unguarded. Regardless, 1,200 Marines in the middle of the day were going to go take this unguarded bridge. This is not one of my points today, but an important note. When you're getting involved in something, you do the best you can with the information you have. That's the best you can do. A lot of folks, they spend their entire lives regretting decisions that they made, even though they made those decisions with the very best of intentions and with the very best of information. Listen, the best you can do is make decisions based on the information that you have. That's the very best you can do. That's the best any of us can do. And that's what we did that day. We started moving. I was the 3rd vehicle back in our column. We were providing navigation for the rest of the battalion, and I had 2 of my vehicles up front. My platoon specifically had the hardback Humvees. If you've seen those, you know that Humvees have the high canopy kind of backs on them. Ours were the ones that had the smaller, shorter, kind of more profiled hardbacks, and we had on top of those either heavy machine guns, 50 caliber machine guns, or tow missiles. So we were pretty heavily armed. We started making our way toward this unguarded bridge, and as we did, we pulled around a corner, and I can see it as clearly as if it was happening right now. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, so the sun was just right to see off in the distance. We came around a corner, and it was a road that led to the bridge. And as we came around the corner, we could look down the road and see the bridge off in the distance. And there was a berm. The bridge was a bit elevated, and then it would continue on the road to the other side. So imagine, we're looking at the berm. On the other side of that berm, of course, is the canal. There was the bridge that went over the canal. That's what we were headed toward. The ground around the road that we were traveling on, it was that really soft dirt, as though it had been plowed to be planted, but nothing had been planted in it. So it was really soft, and thankfully it was. We started making our way toward that unguarded bridge, and as we did, it soon became clear it was not unguarded. We would find out later that what was dropping the mortar rounds on top of us was a D-30 battery. It was a mortar battery set up on the other side of the bridge. It had that road as a pre-planned target. That meant they had practiced dropping mortars on that road, the road that we were going to drive on. And we were. We started driving, and those rounds began to fall. And I remember that the taste of the smoke as it would hit the ground and explode. Remember, I told you the ground was soft. Thankfully, those rounds would go into the ground, and the explosion would happen underground, so the shrapnel was contained. But the smoke would come up, and the explosion, the percussion was happening, and we were driving, and I had this thought as we were driving. You think the weirdest things when people are trying to kill you. I had this thought. This is not supposed to be happening. Those guys back there this morning, the intelligence professionals, they said that this was an unguarded bridge. This wasn't going to happen. But it was happening. We continue to push toward our objective, and that takes us to our first point in this lesson as we talk about resiliency and we talk about making the right decisions. Here's something we all need to know, we have to get a hold of. Sometimes the biggest battles in our lives are the ones that we least expected. Sometimes the biggest battles in our lives are the ones that we least expected. You know why we get thrown down on the ground sometimes when the unexpected jumps in front of us? Because it was unexpected. Because something happens, we say something like this, that was not supposed to happen. Those guys back there, the professionals, they said this could not happen, and yet it did. I'll tell you this, some people are so overwhelmed by the unexpected that they become, listen to me, they become the lifelong victims of a one-time event. If you get nothing else out of what I'm saying today, get a hold of that. Sometimes the unexpected so impacts people that they then become the lifelong victims of a one-time event. You know these people, you have conversations with them, and it doesn't seem to matter what the actual topic of the conversation is. Eventually, it will get back to who hurt them, to what happened, to something back here. And that's not to say that these things that happen back here are unimportant. It's only to say that if we're not careful, we can allow the unexpected to cause us to become lifelong victims. Battles will come. What are battles? Battles are those life situations that, if not addressed, will overwhelm and potentially destroy us. Definitions are important, and I think the definition of battle is an important one. What is a battle? A battle is that life situation that, if not dealt with, has the ability to overwhelm and potentially destroy us. It's something that is working to knock us off course. Battles have enemies. What are enemies? Enemies are anything or anyone that participates on the wrong side of the battle. Anything or anyone that participates on the wrong side of the battle. Now, we have to be careful here. We have to be careful to understand what a battle is and what an enemy is. Not everyone that says stop or tries to get in your way is the enemy. For anyone who's served in combat, we know that one of the things we worry about the most is that blue on blue. That one good guy will shoot another good guy. It happens accidentally. Often it happens because the enemy is misidentified. There's confusion in the middle of the battle. Not everyone who stands up and says stop is trying to hurt you. In fact, often they're trying to help you. But you have to understand that in life, those battles will come, and when they come, if not dealt with, they have the potential to do real damage. We moved toward the berm, and that was our first objective. It wasn't supposed to be. Our objective, my platoons, was to get to the berm, to hold our ground, and to let the rest of the battalion pass through. That's what we were supposed to do. We were told to do that when we believed there was no one on the bridge. But as we got closer to the bridge, we realized it wasn't just the mortars that were falling on us that were a problem. There was another big problem. We found out later that there was a company-sized element of Iraqi soldiers sitting in the berm, pointing toward us with their machine guns. There's a company-sized machine gun position there, and we were going to have to deal with that machine gun position. Again, unexpected. But here's the second point that I take from that, and one that I hope that you will as well. Here's the point. Although you may not get to pick the battles in your life, and rarely do we get to pick the battles, you may not get to decide when you're going to fight, but what you can always decide is how you're going to fight. The one thing that no one can take away from you is your power to decide. And when you find yourself in a battle, even an unexpected one, you get to decide how you're going to deal with the enemy that's on that objective. Let me make this real for a moment. Those marriage battles that all of us who are married have experienced, those will pop up at that time, that moment in time where you didn't even think it was possible, over something you didn't even think you were willing to fight about. Those battles come, and when they do, you don't always get to choose when they happen, but what you can choose is how you're going to fight when they do. Work issues, other issues as they come up, you may not get to choose when they happen, but you can decide what to do when they do inevitably happen. Came home from Iraq, and I processed out of the Marine Corps shortly after. It was something that I had decided to do, something that I was actually looking forward to. I love the Marine Corps. I loved my service. I was very thankful for it, but it was a time where I needed to transition. My family was growing and things were happening, and I transitioned from serving in combat. A month later, I was serving on a church staff. As you can imagine, that was quite an adjustment period. So many things I had to figure out, and so much of it I just didn't understand. People have asked me, did you have post-traumatic stress, and did you deal with combat trauma and all of those things like so many have? I don't know about all of that, but I do know at that moment in time, coming back and transitioning into a different role and a different job, I was definitely struggling with the transition. I went from believing I was important and doing something that really mattered to doing something that seemed less important. I would look at others and say things like they don't understand who I am or where I've been or what I've done. They don't appreciate me. I spent a lot of my days looking back over my shoulder at what I had done and what I had been a part of. A battle came up in my life, one that I didn't expect. It was an emotional battle that really led to a relational battle. I was struggling at home with my wife and with my kids. It became a spiritual battle. It was very, very real in my life. It was something that I did not expect, I didn't see coming, and I didn't handle very well. You see, the key to being resilient is to prepare now for the battles that will inevitably come, because you may not get to choose those battles, but you can choose how you will fight. You need to prepare now so that you will succeed later. Our platoon dealt with that machine gun position exactly as we had trained to do hundreds of times. We didn't hit that machine gun position, as unexpected as it was, and then get together and have a meeting on how we were going to deal with it. We had decided as we trained on the hills of Camp Pendleton and trained in 29 Palms and trained in other places around the world, we had worked out how we would deal with a situation just like that if we ever happened to come in contact with one. And we did. At an unexpected moment in time, because we had prepared ahead of time and made decisions ahead of time, we fought the battle we wanted to fight, even though it wasn't at the time of our choosing. We need to decide that we are going to live and fight honorably and make that decision before we find ourselves in the battle. I wonder, have you ever stepped back from your situation and asked this question? How in the world did I get here? We all find ourselves in those situations. The battle has come. We're now fighting the fight. We feel like we've gotten control of it, and then something changes. This leads to the third lesson from this story. In the midst of the battle, you may make the right decisions and do the things that you're supposed to do, but remember this, change is inevitable. Change is inevitable. Don't be surprised when it happens. The funny thing about battles of all kinds is that the enemy actually gets to say on how the battle goes. The enemy, remember, the one who is fighting on the wrong side of the battle? The battle, that thing which is designed to overwhelm and potentially destroy us, the enemy gets a say in how the battle unfolds. You do the right thing, you make the right decisions, but eventually things change. Before the battle, you do the best you can with the information that you have. But in the battle, you adjust as new information becomes available. My response to change in my life when I came home from Iraq, that change of transition, the response for me was not a good one. I would get frustrated with my children and yell at them. I remember a moment when my son, he was very young, and he did something. I'm not sure exactly what it was. It's not important, and I don't even remember it. I'd only been home for a few days, and I remember getting so angry at whatever it was that he did, which clearly was not important, that it scared him. And you've seen a little kid who doesn't want to cry, but they can't hold it in for very long. This many years later, I had that image of his face burned in my brain. That's how I responded to change. I responded to change by yelling at home, by throwing things, by screaming at my wife, by causing problems for the people at work. That's how I responded to change. The battles come, you may not expect them, but you get to decide how you'll fight when they happen. Decide ahead of time so you deal with them in the right way. But understand in this process, until the battle is over, things can change. And as they change, you need to adjust with new information. We were supposed to stay on the near side of the bridge, the side closest to us, right in front of that berm. We dealt with the machine gun position, but the mortar rounds continued to fall, and so we had to change, we had to adjust. I didn't ask for permission, we just did it. We moved to the top of the bridge and got to a place where I believed we could more effectively deal with the enemy. Listen to me, things will change. In your marriage, things will change. With children, things will change. In your job, things will change. In your life and other relationships, things will change. When they do, will you adjust to what is happening around you? Or will you allow the battle to engulf you because you're unwilling to adjust? We got on top of the bridge, and it was a good change because it got us out of the immediate kill zone. It was a bad change because it put us in a brand new one. For those of you that are military people, you might have imagined taking a platoon of Marines, all in vehicles, and putting them on top of a bridge where mortar rounds are falling is a bad idea. I've given this talk, and people have come up to me afterwards and said, that was a really bad idea. And I just look at them and say, thank you. Thank you. It quickly became clear it was a bad idea. Here's how I knew it was a bad idea. The mortar rounds kept falling. The road was a pre-planned target. The bridge was a closer pre-planned target. At one point, I was standing on the outside of my vehicle trying to get a better vantage point of what was happening. I had the radio in my hand, and I was talking, and the rounds were falling so close to me that as they went, again, into that soft dirt, I'm thankful for the soft dirt, as they went down into that soft dirt and they would explode, the shrapnel was contained, but the percussion, and if you've ever experienced this, it was something that went from the bottom of my feet through the top of my head every time a round fell. The craziest feeling, and one that's not good for you. It was a bad decision, and we were in a bad, bad place. And not only were the mortar rounds falling, but there was an anti-aircraft gun. You've seen these on movies. It was a ZSU 23-4. That's the nomenclature, in case you're interested. But you've seen them on movies. There was a guy sitting on a seat behind the 4-barreled anti-aircraft gun. There was another guy next to it who was doing this to spin it around. And the idea was that they'd protect the bridge from our helicopters coming over. But when we got on top of the bridge, we were now the threat. So just across the canal from us, about 50 meters, this anti-aircraft gun started to spin toward our position. The mortar rounds were falling, the anti-aircraft gun was spinning, and all at once I knew that I had made a bad decision. I don't need anyone to let me know after this that it was a bad decision. I know. People should have died that day. This takes us to another lesson. It's an important lesson. When you are stuck, when you're stuck, you only have two options. You can either stay where you are and die, or you can put one foot in front of the other and move to a place where you can actually win the battle. I checked into 1st Battalion, 5th Marines as a second lieutenant, and before I got to weapons company, where I was during this battle, my first platoon was a rifle platoon in Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. Charlie Company had a motto, and I loved this motto. The motto was this: march or die. I love it because it's so simple. And not a lot to figure out there. You have two choices. You can either march or you can die. And for a rifle company, that was an important thing for us to know. You can press forward or you can stay where you are and die. Listen to me. When you're stuck in life, when the mortar rounds are falling around you, you can feel them coming through your body as the percussion takes place. When that anti-aircraft gun is swinging around and things are going from really bad to a lot worse, you only have two choices. You can march or you can die. And unfortunately, a lot of people decide that things have gotten so bad, that things are so difficult, that it's easier to just stay where they are and give up than to get to a place where they can actually win the fight. But remember what I said as we began. Living is not simply the act of drawing breath. It's not going about your job and doing your thing and making your neighbors think you're doing fine and making the people you work around think you're doing fine. It's not going through the mundane of life. That's not living. Because it's possible to do all of that stuff having given up. I'm not moving forward anymore. It's just too hard. I'll stay in the marriage, but I'm not going to try anymore. I'll stay in this relationship, but I'm just not going to try anymore. I'll stay at this job, but I'm not going to try anymore. It's possible to find yourself in a battle that you didn't expect as the mortar rounds fall around you and the machine gun spins around, and to give up. You're drawing breath. You're doing your thing. You look fine, but spiritually and emotionally and relationally, you're dead. What's crazy is there are a lot of people in my world, in the veteran community, at more than 22 a day that have made that decision. And it's not a spiritual or an emotional or relational death. It's a physical death. Why? Because things got so bad, they said, I can't get out of here. They just sat down. They gave up. Now, none of this is to diminish anyone's struggles, anyone's trials, anyone's difficulties. It's not to say you need to try harder. It's only to say this, that you have a choice. Remember, the one thing no one can take away from you is your ability to decide. But you have to decide. You say, well, Jeremy, what does that look like? It looks like putting one foot in front of the other, and then doing it again and again and again and again, until you're out of the place where the mortar rounds are falling, until you're beyond the machine gun that's swinging around, and you're in a stronger place to fight the battle on your own terms so that you can come out on the other side and win. Don't give up. What's crazy about deciding to march when it would be easier to die is that people will follow. Leadership is the answer. When one decides to march, others will follow. Again, this was not a decision that we made. We decided to get out of that kill zone, and we dealt with the machine gun, the anti-aircraft gun, and we got away from those mortars. We did all that. But again, it wasn't a conference that we had. When I replay this whole scene in my mind, from the beginning to the end, it seems like it was hours long. It was probably a handful of minutes. Things tend to slow down in combat. It wasn't that long. It seems long. But I'll tell you this, we had a few seconds to make a decision to move from where we were to where we needed to be. And we did it not because I'm smart, but because that's what we needed to do. And when we did it, everyone came along with us. A lot of folks should have died right there on top of the bridge, and no one did. Because when someone decides to march, everyone else will follow. This is the final lesson, one that I'm thankful to look back on again and again. It's one that encourages me. Here's the lesson. Victory in life, it comes to the persistent. not the perfect. Victory in life comes to the persistent, not the perfect. We get so caught up in feeling bad about the decisions we made that weren't good ones or that were misinformed or the people that we've hurt along the way. We get so caught up in all of that that we get stuck. And that's when we decide it's easier to die than to march. Listen to me. Victory doesn't come to the perfect. It comes to the persistent. To the one who is willing to say, in spite of my past and my present circumstances, I will put one foot in front of the other and get to the place where I really need to be so that I can fight this battle on my terms. That's it. I believe so often that the simple act of pushing forward is a near superpower because so few people are willing to do it when it matters most. I got to the other side of that, and again, if you've ever been in a firefight, you're familiar with this feeling. There's so much adrenaline and there's so much going on all at once that when it ends, it's almost as though it just ends. And then there's this dump of adrenaline, and all at once you feel exhausted and at peace. It's the strangest thing. The thought I had when I got to the other side of that was this: the enemy doesn't care about me. We think that the people who are fighting against us, that the battles we find ourselves in, that they're personal. That it's someone or something coming after you. And maybe they're using you to get to something else. Maybe right now it's about you. But understand, the battle is not about you. We take things so personally. What I learned on the other side of that, and the thought that I had when we got to the other side, was this: it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who I am or where I come from or the level of education that I have. None of it matters. The enemy is simply trying to kill someone on the other side. That's why victory doesn't come to the perfect. Not to the one who made all the right decisions and said all the right stuff and went to all the right places and came from the right family. Victory comes to the one who is willing, when everything is going bad around them, when the rounds are falling and the machine gun's spinning around, to the one who is willing to put one foot in front of the other and march when it would be easier to die. I'm thankful for the men and women who serve our country. It's a life that is lived with honor and lived by people who should be honored. But that life is fraught with battles. As these men and women come home and deal with so much of what they experienced in their lives, we do our best to help them work through that. But trauma and difficulty and trials, they're not reserved for those who have served in the military. It's just a part of life. And the question when you find yourself in those battles, the question that you must answer is this: what are you going to do about it? There's a picture that I have hanging up over my desk at work. And it's been hanging up over my desk wherever I've had an office for years. It's a picture of my platoon. It was the platoon that I had in Iraq, in Baghdad, throughout that entire engagement and on this day on the bridge. I love that picture. It speaks to me. I know the faces and I know the stories, and some of those stories are not as good as they could have been, and some are much better than you'd imagine. But when I see that picture and I think of that picture in the context of this story, here's the thought that comes to my mind so often. I wonder how many of the young men in that picture would not have made it off of that bridge if I had decided it's easier to stay here and die than it is to get up and move, to march. You see, here's what all of us secretly think. All of us secretly believe that we are the only ones who will be impacted by our decision to die. By our decision to throw in the towel at work or at home, in our relationships, in our marriage, with our kids. We believe we're the only ones who will be impacted. And yet, in our lives, we may not have a picture like mine hanging up over our desk, but in our minds, if we close our eyes, there is a picture very similar to that, full of faces of people who are depending on us to make the right decision, to get up in March when it would be easier to die. Why? Because they're looking for someone to follow, and they're not going to make it if we choose not to. As bad as the battles get, as difficult as life can become, and sometimes those battles come when we least expect them, what we do get to decide is how we're going to fight. We make the right decisions in the battle and things then change. We have to change with them, adjust with the new information, and yet even as we change, things may go from bad to really bad. And when they do, we really only have two decisions that we can make. But make no mistake, they're decisions. They don't happen to us, we happen to them. We can decide to stay where we are and die, or we can march, putting one foot in front of the other, again and again and again, until we find ourselves in a place where we can win the battle. Because victory doesn't come to the perfect, it comes to the persistent, to the one who refuses to quit. That's resiliency. The resilient life isn't the one that is free from trouble, it's the one that has decided before the trouble comes that when it does, and it will, there will be marching, there will be pushing, and there will be winning. But it all comes down to you and to a decision that you have to make. The question before you today is this: when the battle comes, and it will, what are you going to do? Will you march, or will you die? The choice is yours.